Hello, today I want to tell you everything about the topic of navel piercing. My name is Steve Pierce and I have been a piercer for over 20 years. And today you will learn everything from me about this subject. First of all, what are the requirements for a navel piercing? There aren't really many. If you have a navel, it usually works. There are actually some navels that are shaped a bit differently. This naturally depends on how the umbilical cord forms after delivery. Some may have a slightly bulbous appearance, while others may have had an umbilical hernia. Then one must always decide and assess individually, evaluate, and then determine whether it is possible or not. Basically, almost any navel can be pierced. However, there are some navels that are predisposed to a higher risk of migration. I always explain it a bit in cross-section. Imagine if this is the abdominal wall and the belly were halved, and you picture that most people have some sort of pouch or apron at the navel, and then it goes in like this, and then you basically pierce through here. And that's when you pierce through this apron. It's wonderful that it holds. For some, however, it's not like this apron in cross-section, but rather the navel just goes straight in from the abdominal wall. And then it can happen that if I now insert a navel jewelry piece, I create tension, and creating tension during a piercing is almost always a guarantee or poses the risk that it will migrate because I am creating tension and the navel is not resting calmly and relaxed. As soon as I create tension, there is, as mentioned, the risk that the body will reject the piercing. As I said, it needs to be considered on an individual basis. Basically, you have slightly overlapping skin. There is actually no danger at the top of the navel. What differences are there, for example? Some people want an upper navel jewelry or a lower one. The same applies here. Generally, a lower navel piercing is often at risk because it does not have a fold of skin, but rather just skin. When I pierce through, there is a risk involved. On one hand, it usually takes longer to heal. This is also due to the fact that the waistband tends to push the upper ball up when sitting down. Therefore, it usually takes longer for the healing process. Secondly, a stud that is not pierced through the skin fold, so to speak, but goes through the entire skin, is more or less a surface piercing. It takes longer to heal, and there is indeed the risk of migration. However, it needs to be looked at individually, and then it should actually not be a problem for most people. Of course, without wanting to be discriminatory, body fullness is somewhat important, of course. If someone has a lot of body weight, it is usually very difficult, as the navel may no longer be easily recognizable as such. This means that there is also the risk that, let's say, if someone has a lot of abdominal tissue and you were to mark the navel when the person lies down, it often ends up being more of an abdominal wall piercing rather than a navel piercing. And then due to sweat, the wound healing is also somewhat disturbed. But as mentioned, it should be considered individually, and then a piercer should be able to make a good decision. So, requirements and before the piercing. So, the requirements start with the question that often comes up: at what age do we pierce? In Germany, it is generally the case that we are allowed to pierce the navel starting from the age of 14. The body is still growing. I would say it's better to wait until 16, because by then there won't be any major growth spurts. It tends to be, let's say, easier then. What types are there? As mentioned before, some want it at the top, while others prefer it at the bottom. There are also some very unusual placements on the right, left, or sideways. Again, as mentioned, these are usually surface piercings and not proper navel piercings. They can sometimes migrate, or the wound healing is indeed slowed down. A common question is whether a navel piercing can be numbed. No. Yes. It's always very difficult. So basically, anesthesia is a bit of a thing in Germany. Of course, we can only use surface anesthetics. For example, a topical over-the-counter Emla cream can be applied, which numbs the surface. However, we go much deeper, so it usually still hurts. A little bit hasn't killed anyone. Mucous membranes can be numbed very effectively. There are lidocaine sprays that work very quickly and very well. Navel piercings are actually not numbed. The only way to truly numb a navel would be with a syringe. Typically, we are not allowed to do this unless the piercer is a licensed practitioner. That's why there won't be much to it. But honestly, whether I make a puncture and then insert the needle and inject a liquid in there, it usually hurts more than the 1 second of the navel piercing itself. That's why it's not necessary. Many people have already thought about this. First, a sentence. So, as a rule, we have these so-called barbells. These are referred to as banana barbells. A barbell is always a rod with two balls, similar to a tongue bar. This is a banana barbell. You might have seen it before. In this case, there is a ball on the top and bottom. Most of the time, the upper one is slightly larger, and the lower one is slightly smaller. For a double piercing, meaning both top and bottom, I usually use balls of the same size, putting in 4 of them. Some people turn it around. It's up to each individual. One thing we advise against is actually using rings. That was indeed the case. Let me briefly touch on the history of the navel piercing. In fact, the navel piercing is one of the piercings that has made piercings well known in general. It actually has to do with the video Crying by Aerosmith. Now, please don't hold me to it. At some point in the years, there was a scene where a girl got a navel piercing, and that was actually the beginning of the hype surrounding modern piercings. Not from prehistoric times or what some cultures do, some indigenous tribes. In fact, this was the beginning of modern piercing and established the hype. However, a ring is used there, and we categorically advise against rings. There are many reasons for this. Firstly, the ring rotates all the time, which means that germs and bacteria can enter. A barbell, on the other hand, stays very still. The next thing is, when I have a ring in, that ring must always sit straight. This means that as soon as the ring is not sitting straight and it automatically shifts to the side due to the pants or otherwise to the right or left, the piercing channel will adjust. This means that if you later put a regular stud back in, it won't sit straight. Instead, there is a risk that it will eventually be positioned at an angle. 2001. This means that if you put a ring in, you would actually have to constantly roll up some kind of gauze or paper towel and place it in the ring to keep the ring upright. Please don't do that at all, and it's best not to do it later either. These rings really have the problem of distorting your piercing channel. I have experienced this more than once, where there is a risk that the straight jewelry has tilted, and then it has happened that the jewelry has migrated, moving around until it was positioned like this, or sometimes in the other direction. So, we have all seen it. It's best to keep the bubbles in, the bananas, babels, and you'll be on the safe side. Now, let's move on to the piercing itself. The question is always, does it hurt? Really? Well, I actually have 2 navel piercings. It's really bearable, so you don't need to worry. And everyone has survived it. And usually, it's a very quick process. 2001. So I might need about 1 second for the piercing, and I finish the entire piercing within 20 seconds. So, then the question always comes up. I actually had a discussion where my sister said that a navel piercing shouldn't bleed. That's total nonsense. I always say there are only 3 types of people who don't bleed. Those are people who have low blood pressure, haven't drunk enough, or are dead. Every mortal human being who lives also bleeds. Bleeding afterwards is normal, sometimes even a bit stronger. Everything is normal, so don't worry about it. If it continues to bleed for a long time, leave the blood crust on before you disinfect. You might be sealing it up again because whenever you remove the crust, it can start bleeding again. If necessary, it's better to leave the crust on for a day or 2 until the epithelial cells have started to close the piercing channel. Then, it usually stops. So, no bleeding yet. Don't worry. Don't think too much about it. Navel piercings are harmless after the procedure. Now let's talk about some factors. Sometimes a yellowish substance may come out. This is usually wound secretion, unless your piercing is thick, red, warm, and painful. And that is always a phrase I preach very, very often. Don't worry, I actually have this. I've been a piercer for 20 years. For 15 years, people were completely relaxed. I don't know what happened in the last 5 years. Someone put some nonsense on the internet, things like keloids. These are actually keloids. Keloids do not go away on their own. I hate the word proud flesh. Please remove it from your vocabulary. 2001. What sometimes happens with navel piercings is that small bubbles form at the bottom, like wound fluid blisters. They usually occur when the wound fluid cannot drain cleanly due to pressure on the jewelry, and then they often form at the bottom. This can happen with any piercing, most often with cartilage, sometimes with the navel. Then the wound fluid runs under the skin and forms a small blister next to it. It's not wild meat. Please don't come into my studio and talk to me about wild meat. I have really developed a strong hatred for this word. Remove this word from your vocabulary. Keloids can occur at the ear most of the time. These are wild piercings that need to be cut away. These blisters are soft, which means I can open them, disinfect them, and if in doubt, treat them with Hyrosur or another antibiotic ointment. Then they will go away. It's important to worry only if it is thick, red, warm, and painful. Essentially, every piercing forms a kind of protective function. I always explain that when it is the jewelry, the body wants to form a kind of callus around it and creates a sort of protective skin. You can see this when you press on it. It's like a protective layer around it. This skin is normal. It's not excess tissue. It's completely normal. It can happen with any piercing. And of course, Basically, it's good and important that if you have questions, feel free to come by. Better to ask too much or too little. But the basic rule is, as long as your piercing is not thick, red, or warm, don't worry. Everything is perfectly normal. Now, there are a few specifics to consider, especially if someone is, let's say, a bit fuller and the piercing channel is very short with not enough space for the end of the jewelry. It can happen that you look in the morning or at some point and the upper ball is slightly pulled in. As I said, that's mostly it. If it is pierced too short and then swells a bit, please go to your piercer, or in this case, probably to us. We will put in a longer bar for a few days until it has gone down again. If it is thick, red, and warm, then it should be treated accordingly. If it is inflamed, one should obtain something like Tyrosurgil in Germany. This is an antibiotic ointment that is available over the counter. Tyrosur, great ointment. Apply it for a few days until it is good again. Then you can switch back to the original jewelry. The pressure from the jewelry just needs to be relieved. As mentioned, it's better to come in too often than too rarely. But basically, if the ball is not pulled in, or if the beer is thick, red, warm, and hurts, everything is great. Yes, regardless of whether it is a bit red around the area, that is also normal during the wound healing process. When the new epithelial cells start to form, it is normal for the skin to peel at the top and new skin to develop. It's like with a cut, everything is normal. Yes, thick, red, warm, it hurts. And it's in combination, not individually, but all together. Especially in summer, sweat and chlorine are factors that piercings do not like. If you get the piercing done in summer and sweat a lot or something like that, sweat is always a guarantee that it can cause irritation in a fresh piercing. Now the question often arises, what about water? Generally, salt water is the best thing you can do for any piercing. It supports wound healing, especially for inflamed piercings. It hurts, but it helps. Please avoid chlorinated water for the first 4 weeks as chlorine is very aggressive. Fresh water is generally not a concern. Of course, it's important not to use the last dirty rag. Clean water is essential, not the bacteria-laden broth. Just take a good look at the water, of course. Otherwise, in case of doubt, if it cannot be avoided or if something like a sauna is done, apply Vaseline or other cream to the piercing channel. It seals it so that no sweat or chlorine can get in. That's always the advice we give. When in doubt, as mentioned, use gyrosurgical treatment. Otherwise, just use octenicept as usual. And just to quickly add, as I remembered something afterwards, the question often arises, can I still shower and bathe with a navel piercing? Of course, showering is not a problem at all. When bathing, please actually consider the issue that you are lying in dirty water. This means, if possible, avoid bathing for the first 4 weeks. Otherwise, apply Vaseline or lanolin if you can, but please do not bathe during the first 4 weeks, as you will be in dirty water. I forgot to mention that. And now let's continue with the video. Clothing is still a topic. There was just a time with high-waisted pants, and I'm not a fan of that at all. I love the time when hip huggers were still in fashion because these high-waisted pants usually go over the jewelry and then people always get caught and so on. And that usually either leads to infections or, as I mentioned, the jewelry has become misaligned. Please make sure it doesn't rub or press. I'm not a fan of bandages at all. Let it be exposed to fresh air. I take the example of when you cut your finger and put a bandage on it, and after 1 or 2 days you take it off, then you see it all weirdly softened and kind of gross. This also happens with the piercing. Sweat promotes inflammation. Keep the piercing exposed to fresh air. Unless you are doing sports and there is a risk of getting caught, for example, it's better to cover it so that nothing gets snagged. But otherwise, really let it be exposed to fresh air or it will bleed afterwards. Of course, that's clear. Otherwise, always keep it in the fresh air. Let air get to it. It can dry and is always the best. For care, recommend Prontalind or octenicept, a wound disinfectant without alcohol. Just remove the crust a little, 2 to 3 times a day, spray it with a cotton swab, and then simply move it up and down a bit so that the solution gets into the piercing channel. Otherwise, leaving it alone is really the best thing you can do. I mentioned that inflammation is important. Thick, red, warm hurts. Only treat accordingly with Tyrosurgil or a comparable antibiotic ointment in combination. Otherwise, yes, in case of doubt, always consult a doctor. It's very important. I am not providing medical advice here, but rather sharing an experience report. I always have to mention that for legal reasons. In case of doubt, always consult a doctor to have it checked. Of course, if you delay addressing the inflammation for too long, it can actually lead to the worst case scenario that has never been experienced. But the internet is not entirely wrong about that. An infection can indeed spread into the abdominal wall. However, one really has to delay it for as long as possible. If you're really in doubt, it's better to come to us once more to take a look. And if there's no one available at your piercer, you should go to a doctor as a last resort. They will prescribe you antibiotics and remove it. Inflamed piercings are not always the right choice, as you have to keep in mind. that you have a piercing channel. Now there is an inflammation present. The jewelry keeps the piercing channel open. If you take the jewelry out, the top and bottom will close up and the inflammation can remain inside. This means that in the worst case, the inflammation could eventually become inflamed from the inside after years. Therefore, please assess each case individually. Removing inflamed piercings is not always necessarily the right approach. Yes, that would actually conclude my discussion on navel piercings. If you have any questions, feel free to write to us. Our clients always receive an aftercare sheet when they visit our studio. There is a care sheet that contains all the current information. And of course, you also have the option to use our Steve Pierce smartphone app, which is available on Google Play and in the App Store. Simply enter Steve Pierce and you will find information on every piercing that I explained to you. These videos are also included and you can write to us at any time. That's it for now, my dear ones. My name is Steve Pierce. I bid you farewell and wish you all the best.